everyone, welcome to the Christ Pearls channel. This is Jessica. I wanted to do a video today about, I guess, all the crazy news that's going on with Donald Trump and his attempted assassination. It looks like he got hurt, but narrowly missed a bullet that was aimed at his head. And I can't help but feel like this is one of those signs of the times. Going back to David J. Ridge's book, 100 Signs of the Times, I feel like we're seeing a political climate that is so polarized. And it seems as though the violence, the civil unrest is widespread. This is one that kind of stood out to me. It's this widespread despising of good people. And I don't know necessarily that Donald Trump is good people, but I mean, somebody tried to kill him just because they disagreed with him or don't like him. I mean, the motive is still trying to be determined by the FBI, but for whatever reason, somebody tried to kill him. And you know, there's also like just this whole, I guess you could call it Trump derangement syndrome. That's what I call it, where it's just people despise him. They don't even really know why. I can't say I've ever been a big fan, but I don't despise him. And I mean, just some of these signs that we're seeing, like strikes, overthrowing of governments, gang warfare, all of these things.
It's baby spider. It's gross.
Ew.
I killed it.
My son just killed a spider. Thank you, buddy. He protects me from spiders. I was bit by a spider when I was a little child and I have fear of them. So now my son goes around hunting spiders for me. He's the best. So, yeah, but these like overthrowing of governments, we see this around the world. We see gang warfare, violence, this disrespect for authority increasing. And it is one of the signs of the times. So you'll see in David J. Ridge's book, he lists out scriptures related to this. He quotes Bruce R. McConkie. I mean, this is happening, and it has been for a long time. And I think people can argue that, you know, this has been going on for a long, long time, and I believe that that's true. And I wanted to tie in some of these things that have happened in the past and talk a little bit about people's theories. So this is going to be a gospel theory episode, and it's going to be touching on, I guess you could say, that esoteric space again. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, let me just go back over to my study diagrams here and show you. This is what I mean. Core eternal doctrine, supporting teachings, policy teachings, esoteric teachings. And whenever we get into supposition and gospel theory, we're talking in this space right here, esoteric teachings. And the core eternal doctrine is the signs of the times. We're living in the last days. This has been going on since the dawn of the Restoration, really since the Reformation that led to the Restoration. And we see that in the scriptures. And this book by David J. Ridge's, called 100 Signs of the Times, is basically a textbook of all the signs in the scriptures that are noted, broken out, and many of these things that occurred during the Reformation, like the discovery of America, the establishment of the United States Constitution. This is kind of where the Restoration began, right? Because this is what led to Joseph Smith being able to start the church and raise up the ensign to the nations. We have the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, the restoration of the priesthood and the priesthood keys, the restoration of the true church. We have, once restored in the last days, the true church will never again be lost through apostasy. And this is all throughout the scriptures. They're noted here. We've got Daniel 2:44. You can cross-reference that with Revelation 14:6. You can also look at D&C 1:10:16, 1:12:30, 27:6, and verses 13 through 14 also in 27. The church will be established in the top of the mountains. Now, this has multiple fulfillments. So Ridge has noted that this has multiple meanings. And one of the meanings that the prophets have declared is that it includes the church, the conference center in Salt Lake City, and then also a temple in Jerusalem in the future. The church will grow to fill the entire earth. This happens all the way through the millennium. And these prophecies were part of that restoration period. And then we've got some other things that occurred. So Joseph Smith, now, I think a lot of people could have seen a civil war on the horizon, but Joseph Smith very accurately predicted how this would go down. In Doctrine and Covenants, section 87, he says, "Verily thus saith the Lord concerning the wars that will shortly come to pass." So the Lord is talking to Joseph Smith. "Beginning at the rebellion of South Carolina, which will eventually terminate in the death and misery of many souls, and the time will come that war will be poured out upon all nations, beginning at this place." So the prophecy says that when the Civil War happens, it's going to pour out misery upon all the nations. I mean, Missouri got hit really hard, and after what they did to the saints, it appeared that the Lord allowed some righteous judgment to be poured out on those people, and it did not end well for them. In fact, Brian Stutzman, he wrote a book about all the prophecies of Joseph Smith that have come to pass, and he talks about how Missouri did get punished. They did get, I guess you could say, swept clean, if you will. And a lot of the people who were involved in the death of Joseph and Hiram, they suffered horrible fate. There are several different videos where Brian Stutzman has been interviewed, and he's talked about this. I think if you go on YouTube and you just type in Brian Stutzman's name, it'll come up. I know he's on Word Radio. He's been on several different podcasts, but you can just look up all the stuff he's talking about. I think even David Alexander, he's the guy who converted to the church recently in the last little over a year or two. And he has a YouTube channel, and he is like a former evangelical who used to attack the church. And now he's one of the most faithful members that I've seen, bearing his testimony on a weekly basis. And I think he also had Brian Stutzman on, but he talks about this. He talks about the Civil War and how so many prophecies that we think maybe still need to happen, they did happen during the Civil War. And I don't know if they'll happen again, but they did happen. There was a lot of misery poured out on those people and on that place specifically. And ever since then, war has been poured out on the whole earth. And so we're going to look at that a little bit today and talk about some of these signs of the times and maybe how they relate to current events. So in the news, we have this assassination attempt of former President Donald Trump. And what's really interesting to me, we're going to talk about this book too. It's a really good one. But what's really interesting to me is just the iconic figures that are popping up in the imagery in the media. So right here you see him side by side with Ronald Reagan, who also had an assassination attempt on his life by a total psycho who was like a lunatic. We're not really sure what the motive is for what happened this last couple days with Donald Trump, but it does have some similarities. And look at all this imagery. I mean, this is incredible what happened. It's kind of a miracle, if you ask me. I think it's amazing that he turned his head just at the right split second to avoid a bullet going right into his skull. So I don't know what you want to call it, luck, miracle, whatever. It was amazing that he did not get hurt worse. And somebody died. A man died and 2 others were critically wounded. So it was a pretty big deal. So I wanted to cover a little bit of the updates about what's been going on with Donald Trump. There's an FBI investigation. They're saying questions are swirling about how this 20-year-old man was able to ascend undetected to the roof and gain a directional line of sight and fire several rounds at the former president. The alleged gunman's motive was still unclear as the investigation was continuing as of Wednesday. This man, Crooks, was killed at the scene. And then we've got a few things that AP noted, what we don't know, what we do know. So what we don't know, they say, is the shooter's motive. We don't know why wasn't he stopped. There's a little bit of, I guess, discrepancy about that. Why the building was unsecured, because it seems as if it should have been secured. I mean, he was close enough. According to this, it says the would-be assassin fired his AR-style rifle from a building that was close enough for a marksman to hit a human-sized target. A security expert said that the structure should have been secured and under surveillance. So the expectation is that this should have been secured, but it wasn't. And then what we know, the police were aware that Crooks was at the rally. There was some suspicious activity going on before. They kind of summarized how he was pacing outside of the metal detectors. There were police reports of his behavior that were being exchanged with photos of the suspect. Witnesses later pointed out just how he was like carrying a rifle. He was getting on the roof. People were pointing at him. They were shouting. You can see how close people were. They saw him getting up on this roof. So, I mean, it was pretty crazy, apparently, from all of the media flurry that I've seen since it happened. They're calling it an absolute abysmal failure. They're saying, the guy was only 147 yards away, which was, he had like a direct line of sight. It shouldn't have been open. This shouldn't have been allowed to happen. Intelligence agencies are, I guess, investigating it, but really it's the Secret Service. It's on them. They should have secured the area, and this seems to be the prevailing opinion in the media. He had bomb-making materials they found in a car that he had driven to the rally. He used a gun that was purchased by his father to commit the crime. But the agency they still don't understand his motive. When they looked into his past, they found that he had worked at a nursing home as a dietary aide. Records showed he was registered as a Republican, but that he had donated to a progressive political action committee on January 20th, 2021, which is the day that President Joe Biden was sworn into office, and he's a Democrat. So there's questions about what his political leanings really are. It's unclear. Maybe he was just unhinged. There's just all these different theories going on because they're noting how he had been bullied. He was kind of a loner. One report I had seen said his parents were psychologists. They were speculating if he was like taking medications. I think that's something they're still investigating. I haven't seen anything about that saying that that's confirmed. So there's just all these different angles of who is this guy? Why would he try to shoot Trump? Was he just unhinged? Is there more to the story? I saw that Glenn Beck was looking into this. He's got all kinds of people he's been interviewing. They were talking theories. They were talking about possible conspiracy theories. I mean, he tends to touch on those kinds of things. So this whole channel has several video clips that you can check out where they're investigating that. Also on Redacted, like they were showing how here's the building 147 yards away. Here's where Trump was. I mean, it's so direct. Like it's hard to understand why the Secret Service did not secure this building and make sure that nobody could get up there. It's just very, very difficult to understand. And I don't know, I guess there's some theories that Redacted was going over that they think that the water tower nearby could be kind of like the grassy knoll. So they're kind of comparing this to the JFK assassination, talking conspiracy, saying, that this is like got all kinds of questions surrounding it. Like you can see this water tower over here. Yep. And they just kind of put together this map. It's taking a while to load, but you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So they're saying, like, look at all this. None of this is secured. This is where the rally is. It doesn't make any sense. Like, Trump's down here, and there's all this, like, stuff around that is just open. So anyway, they're going into all of this, and it's kind of bringing up things from the past. J.D. Vance was just announced as the new VP that's going to be on the ticket with Trump. He's, I guess you could say, one of the more right-leaning conservatives. He's like anti-woke. He's maybe even more conservative than Trump ever was. So I'm not sure how to interpret that, but this is all playing a role into like this political climate. And then, of course, you have this crazy assassination attempt that's just giving Trump like steam in his campaign. And you've got, sorry, my kids are playing. And then you've got all this iconic imagery coming out. So naturally, it makes me think back to a couple of theories that people have. One of those would be the Michael Rush interpretation of Ezra's eagle, which is where basically the feathers are presidents or the office of president. And I have a little, this is like my notes on it. It's just a little spreadsheet tab that I made. And I was trying to align this and understand some of the things that both Michael Rush had talked about, and then also Morgan Philpot. He does all kinds of little lectures that people record and they post them on YouTube, and I've been to one of his, and he's really nice. I did talk to him about this just to make sure I had it right, because I was having trouble trying to understand how this lined up, and it was easier for me to create a visual in a way that I could understand it. And so I consulted with Morgan in a private message just trying to make sure I had this right, and he looked at it and he gave me the thumbs up on it. So it's good as far as I understand. It'd be hard for me to get in depth on it, but I think you could check out his theories on that. I don't need to explain it all because I think he does a better job of that, but I'm just going to try to give you in a nutshell what I have documented here so that hopefully you can see it. So the point of why I'm bringing this up is because we see this political climate, we see this violence, this crazy stuff going on in the media, in American politics, in world politics, because I think if you expand on the global stage, you'll see similar things happening in other countries that are happening here. And I would say maybe we're even a step behind where some of these other countries are in terms of like the things that are playing out on the world stage. And Morgan, he had identified what I guess you could call a parallel between the things that happened with ancient Israel and the things that are happening globally, and particularly in America and Utah. And why that's important is because America is where the restoration occurred. This is in the last days, it's the Gentile nations, these Western nations that received the gospel first. And it's sort of paralleling with the things that happened back in the old world in ancient Israel when they received the gospel first. So we're seeing a parallel between the northern kingdom of Israel, and remember the northern kingdom was conquered first by Assyria and Babylon, and I mean, it's been conquered so many times, but basically it was conquered first and then later the southern kingdom. So you're seeing this northern kingdom parallel with the United States presidents, like on the federal level. But then on the state of Utah, there's also this parallel happening. And one thing that's interesting about Utah is if you flip it around, like upside down, it matches Israel's layout geographically. So there's a lot of parallels just with the geographic looks and features of Utah with Israel. And there's also the spiritual parallels because we have Salt Lake City with the temple, the saints establishing like a Zion community there, and then the world kind of coming in and I guess you could say conquering it. And that's what you see here. So in the southern kingdom, there were 15 judges. This seems to parallel the 15 governors who functioned under Utah when it was a territory of the United States. But then when it actually became a state, and we've seen the federal government exert extreme control over the state of Utah, there's so many things we could go into on that, but I think Morgan does the best job of explaining that. So you can look up his videos, literally just type Morgan Philpot on YouTube, and there's like so many videos of his lectures. And you'll see that the Southern Kingdom, when they switched from judges to more of like a fallen state where they had desired to have kings like all the places around them, then you see this kind of parallel happening. And we're right here with Spencer Cox, and there's a new election about to take place, so we'll see how that plays out. There's a lot of controversy with this. There's a lot of opposition within the Republican Party over Spencer Cox and his, I guess, leading opponent. So there's just a lot of drama happening here. And similar to these ancient days, just lots of drama, lots of conquering, lots of corruption. And we see that happening in our politics today on, I guess, these two different levels. So there's these two parallels. Now, going back over to the Northern Kingdom parallel, this parallels with the federal level, like the presidency of the United States. And this is more, I guess you could say, complex because the way that this ended up lining up, and this is why I had trouble lining it up, is because I was trying to understand at what point Morgan was seeing the parallel begin. And so I had to consult with him on this. But basically, from George Washington to Abe Lincoln, the Constitution was fine. He uses some scripture references for this, and I kind of noted some of these here about the Civil War, about just how the Constitution, let's see, let me go over to Doctrine and Covenants really quick, and I'll go to, I think it's section 98. Let me just see if I can find it. I should have pulled it up before, but I kind of forgot about this one. But just to illustrate, let me see what verse that was. 6 through 10. Is it that one? Yes, it's this one. So this is what the Lord said about the Constitution. Therefore, I, the Lord, justify you and your brethren of my church in befriending that law, which is the constitutional law of the land. And as pertaining to law of man, whatsoever is more or less than this cometh of evil. I, the Lord God, make you free. Therefore ye are free indeed, and the law also maketh you free. So this is the key verse here. As pertaining to law of man, whatsoever is more or less than this cometh of evil. What is this? It's the constitutional law of the land. And this is the land that Joseph Smith lives in. God is talking about America. He's talking about the Constitution that we have. And the time that this is given is August 6th, 1833. So as of August 6th, 1833, the Lord says the Constitution is something we should befriend. It's a good law, and it'll protect us. But anything that is more or less than this cometh of evil. So we see a little bit of a prophecy happening here. And so this is kind of the trigger that Morgan was seeing, the connection that he made. And I thought this was really interesting because he's basically saying that when you get to this more or less something evil comes, he views this period with Abe Lincoln as a period where something more did come. And what is that more thing that came? Well, Abraham Lincoln, he redefined the role of the president to give the executive branch full power over Congress and other branches of government. Lincoln believed that preserving the Union was his top priority, and he was willing to defy the Constitution, Congress, and the Supreme Court to do so. Now, this is something that I Googled, okay? So Google AI came up with this, not me. Lincoln he also used his 1864 re-election victory to promote the 13th Amendment, which would end slavery nationwide. And at first you're like, oh, that's great. It ended slavery nationwide, and we love Abe Lincoln, and this is awesome. And I think you can have either opinion about him. You can love him or hate him, but, it was great that slavery ended, right? I agree with that. But notice what happens here. So this is later. Remember, 1833 is when God said that to Joseph Smith. But now we're in the 1860s. So basically, this is where things kind of shifted. So Lincoln used his authority as the commander-in-chief to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which came on January 1st, 1863, which declared freedom for slaves in 10 Confederate states. Lincoln also used his 1864 re-election victory to promote the 13th Amendment, which would end slavery nationwide. The Senate passed the amendment in April 1864, and the House adopted it in January of 1865, but Lincoln did not live to see it ratified in December 1865. Now, why didn't he live? Because he was assassinated, okay? And we just had an assassination attempt on Trump. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution provides that, quote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction, unquote. Notice the exception in the wording of the 13th Amendment, which makes slavery acceptable under condition of criminal conviction. Basically, the government can take away your freedom. That's the gist of it. So we see some, I guess you could say, corruption of the law entering in slowly over time. And I kind of went through this and tried to find a few key points. I noticed that we had a switch from bimetallic to gold standard in 1834, which actually seemed to help. This was under Andrew Jackson's administration, and it seemed to stabilize things for a time from what I could gather. And I'm not the biggest history buff, but just I was trying to understand how this parallel could give me a little bit more to think about in terms of the signs of the times. And so this point with Lincoln is where we see a major shift in the Constitution that many argue is good, but it's also allowed the federal government to expand its power. And this is where Morgan identified what he described as a fallen kingdom cycle. So he kind of labeled it that, and I just put that label here. The fallen kingdom cycle begins. And then we see World War I, and it comes after the Civil War, right? So Joseph Smith, when he was talking to God, God said that war would be poured out on all nations, and this happens after the Civil War. This is one of the signs of the times in the 100 Signs of the Times book that David J. Ridges very nicely bulleted for us. War starts in South Carolina, which is really interesting that Joseph Smith got that so perfect that he was able to predict exactly where that would begin. And we saw these things happen. So here's where war starts getting poured out on the whole earth, just like it was prophesied. And this is what, in a book called Prophecy Key to the Future, Duane S. Crowther's, this is the book right here, and I've read this book, and I'd like to talk more about it. I actually have a chapter summary on every single chapter of this book, and there's a lot of things in it that I think are really applicable to today. This book was originally written as a paper. It was like back in the 60s. It for about 20 years was under one publishing company, and then the author was able to I think it was from Cedar Fort originally, and the author was able to get rights back. So it's available now on Deseret Bookshelf Plus. You can read it, and that's how I read it. I own it. It's a good book. I enjoyed it, and I took tons of notes on it, so I'd like to do a video about that in the future. If that interests everyone, let me know in the comments if it does. And he, in the book, has this timeline, which isn't necessarily a timeline, like it gives the year and the dates. It's more of just a chronology of events that occurs. That timeline, somebody had converted it to a poster, and I have it saved in my spreadsheet. So let's look at that really quick. But basically, he has this period of wars that start with the Civil Wars, and he calls this preparatory wars. And this happens during the time of the Gentiles. And then he sees this kind of leading into and leading up to the millennium, and Christ coming and beginning the millennium. And he basically has the restoration of the gospel. It kind of precedes this Civil War era and then starts growing. We see a fullness of the time of the Gentiles starting to occur. There's the prophecy about missionaries being called home. He kind of touches on that. You could arguably say that happened in 2020. It's hard to say. I kind of view it that way because they literally had to come home, and it was out of every land. And then at one point, you could only serve online, and you could only serve in your home country. And that was for, in some places, a couple years. It really depended on the location and the government there. And then he sees this leading into a third world war. And recently we saw the attack on Israel, which has appeared to be a kickoff to some really serious consequences. We also saw Russia invade Ukraine. And it just seems like this is all sort of starting to bleed into each other, these wars over there in the Middle East. America's involved, NATO's involved. So it feels like this is maybe about to happen, and that's why I feel like his timeline is still very relevant, because the way he has it organized, I think it does match the signs of the times that are noted here in this other book by David J. Ridges. These rely mostly on scriptures and a little bit of commentary, whereas like Ridges, he relies a lot on the scriptures, and he structured it like a seminary or institute manual, because he's written a lot of those manuals that we have, and or helped to write them. And the one by Duane S. Crowther, though, he uses mostly commentary from the early days of the church, Joseph Smith. There's a lot by Orson Pratt, Brigham Young, just a lot of early apostles and prophets. He uses that a lot to help understand these periods of wars. And one of the things that was talked about is the politics of the day. And that's kind of why I started thinking a little bit about his book, because it does feel like we're building up to something. And I do see that pattern happening where there's like preparatory wars, and then there's this period of war being poured out on all the earth. And you'll notice here that the Michael Rush interpretation of Ezra's eagle, where each feather represents a president or the office of the president, and it starts to tie in here and overlap with the way that this fallen kingdom cycle pattern that Morgan Philpot, I guess you could say, identified. He's the only person I've ever seen even present this idea, and it's sort of like lining up. So basically this pattern just repeats and repeats, and he sees it as repeating until the second coming. And the theory as it goes is that these all seem to end like right here at the end of the next cycle. So there's like 2 cycles, and to me that matches very well with this. It's like we see these preparatory wars and then wars of total destruction. I would see that as like period 1, period 2. I think if you look at the book of Revelation, you're going to see this structure. I think if you look at the allegory of the olive trees, you'll see a structure there too, all happening during the restoration. It just all kind of lines up into what I think the scriptures are describing as a buildup of wars. And so that's why it kind of started ringing little bells in my head, like, hey, maybe there is something going on here. I'm not sure how long it'll take to happen, but it does feel like times are getting more intense and the wars are becoming more serious, especially with the type of weapons we have today. I mean, can you imagine what a nuclear war would do? There would just be total devastation all over the earth. And let's hope it doesn't come to that, but I don't know how else this is going to end. So we know that it ends ultimately with our Savior. And it sounds like it gets to a point where he's going to have to come back. And it seems that this political strife we're seeing could lead to that. So let's go back to Donald Trump now. I see a connection between him and Richard Nixon. And I'm going to say why. It's because of a presidential power that Nixon tried to employ that Donald Trump has been talking about utilizing in his next administration if he is to be reelected. And people have mixed emotions about it. Conservatives praise it. I think far left people criticize it. And let me just explain what it is. So this talks about Donald Trump's proposal to use the impoundment authority. And it says, in a video published to his campaign website on June 20th, 2023, former President Donald Trump declared he would use impoundment authority to reduce federal spending. Specifically, he stated, I will then use the president's long-recognized impoundment power to squeeze the bloated federal bureaucracy for massive savings. This will be in the form of tax reductions for you. This will help quickly to stop inflation and slash the deficit. Impoundment power refers to the ability of the president or the executive branch to withhold congressionally appropriated funds from their intended use. So basically, Congress appropriates funds, but then the executive branch says, nope, sorry, you can't use it. It goes past our budget, and the White House is supposed to be able to set the budget, and Congress should work within the budget, but they don't. And why don't they? Well, it's because of something that happened in 1974 with President Nixon. While President Trump argues this ability is long recognized and undisputed, Congress has taken definitive steps to limit presidential impoundment authority in the past, and that's true. They did, especially through the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. This is the act that President Nixon signed. President Trump has argued this restriction of executive authority is unconstitutional and has vowed to challenge Congress's limits on presidential impoundment authority in the courts. Okay, so basically, President Trump is seeing out of control spending, and he's seeing what it's doing to our economy, and he's like, you know what, this needs to stop. This power of impoundment that the Constitution allocated to the executive branch as a check on Congress's spending needs to return. So he plans to challenge it. It'll probably end up having to go to the Supreme Court if he did try to use this because of this Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. They want to challenge it. Basically, if you look at the Trump campaign, they're talking about just exercising it, and then it'll just end up in court, and they want to bring it to court because they argue that it's unconstitutional. The Constitution gave this power to the executive branch as a check against Congress's spending, and that power needs to return to the executive branch in their view. So that's what President Trump's doing. And if you go back to 1974, and let's look at what Nixon did. So in 1971, Nixon announced complete abandonment from the gold standard. The reason he did that is because we kind of had to. We were in a bind, and they did it to save the economy from crashing because of our out-of-control spending. And he wanted to try to get this in control, and so he was going to use this presidential power of impoundment. Okay, so in 1974, Nixon was basically forced to sign the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act. And why is that? It's because he was being forced out of office because of Watergate. And basically, to save his own hiney, he signed this act. Even though he really, I guess you could say, ideologically was against that, because he wanted to use this power of impoundment to rein in congressional spending to help alleviate inflation that was happening. They used this moving away from the gold standard, moving to the petrodollar as a way to save the economy, but he viewed it as, I guess you could say, a band-aid or like a means to an end. And ultimately, he wanted to rein in that congressional spending using the Impoundment Act, or using the power of impoundment, I should say. And people didn't like that. And why didn't they like it? It's because you have these bureaucracies that want to keep spending money. And you see this, I guess you could say, Gadianton style of government happening now, where basically you have people in Congress who appropriate funds in a way that benefits them because it allows them to conduct essentially what's insider trading, because they're able to control the stock market through the appropriation of federal funding. And you've got Congress people, I'm not even going to name names because I don't want to get in trouble for it, but follow Unusual Whales on X and you'll see what I'm talking about. They basically call out all of these top people in Congress, senators and House of Reps, who are involved in this. They make a ton of money in the stock market doing single trades. So they're not just like putting money in their 401k and gaining. They're like doing individual trades on stocks that they know are going to do well. So they have an advantage. And they make a ton of money. I'm talking multi-millions of dollars. So we've got this going on, and they can only do this because of the system that we're on. Okay, and the fact that Congress's spending never gets reined in, there's no check on it anymore, has led to a lot of the problems that we have. We've got basically a few bankers in control of our entire money system right now, and it didn't used to be that way. And so I'm seeing some connection between Nixon's approach to trying to rein in spending and Donald Trump's approach. Okay, and if it's true that Nixon is a short feather, like let's say this theory is totally valid, and it makes sense now to me why there's so much opposition to Donald Trump. He's using powers of the presidency that interfere with people's ability to make themselves rich, as far as I'm concerned. And I can see that happening. I feel like it was happening in the past. I mean, it's been exactly 50 years since this act was brought forward and signed. And we're seeing almost like a repeat. The fact that it's coming up again in the media, that this is something that people are criticizing. I mean, it's just like history repeats over and over again. And it just gets more and more intense with each generation. So we have that. And then also with Kennedy, he was a short feather in Michael Rush's theory on the first wing. And I saw this interview recently with RFK Jr., and I don't even remember where I saw it, but he basically said that he was well aware of the fact that JFK and his father, who both were assassinated, they wanted to break up the CIA into smaller units and spread them out across the country, kind of like people have been talking in the news about doing to the FBI, just basically decentralizing them, cutting their budget was the number one way they were planning to do this, and to like limit their power, because they felt that this bureaucracy was so powerful that they had more power than the elected officials. And this, to me, is a red flag and sort of speaks to why maybe Kennedy was assassinated and why, the conspiracy theorists feel the way that they do. And I feel like there is a conspiracy here. I don't know why they can't just release these files and just be open and honest, unless there was something that they're worried would reveal. I think maybe the power of the bureaucracy. That's my opinion. I lean towards the conspiracy on this one. I just think that it was a conspiracy. I don't know how else to look at it. It's just too crazy. And I think in time you start to see that, yeah, something happened there and they just don't want us to know about it. And I don't know if it'll ever be brought to light, but I do see him as a short feather, I guess you could say, and Nixon too. And I see Donald Trump as kind of working to do the same thing. He wants to do the same thing. He wants to limit the power of the bureaucracy. He wants to cut their budget. He wants to decentralize them out of Washington and give more power back to the states. He wants to rein in congressional spending and use the power of the presidency as the check to do that. So this would be very difficult for Gadianton robbers who want to get gain. And they would not like this. And I see that as being opposition for the Gadianton government. So I don't know. I see it as being, at this point, a pretty good, strong theory. There are little flaws with it, and I want to, I guess, give the opportunity to talk about that too. So in a future video, I plan to cover an old theory that has to do with Ezra's eagle. This is from, I think, 2002, and it was a theory about Rome, and we're going to get into this on a separate video. So stay tuned for that if that interests you. Watch for that video, and let me know in the comments if you want to see that. And basically, I made a diagram. It follows the structure and layout of this diagram, which was by Mike Crowley. And he's the one who's over the Ezra's Eagle group. He's the administrator in that group in Facebook. Okay, sorry, I had to pause there. I was like coughing. I think my throat's getting dry from talking. But Mike had made this really great little infographic that just shows how Michael Rush's theory works. He sees FDR as this second feather on the first wing that was longer than the rest. He has Nixon and Kennedy as the short feathers on the first wing. And then when it switches over to this smaller wing, we have Trump as the first short feather, Biden as the second, and then like a 3 and 4 who should end up getting devoured by the eagle heads. And that hasn't happened yet. So these two feathers, we're not sure who they are yet. I know right now it's looking like it's just a repeat of Biden and Trump, but I guess we'll just have to see. I have a hard time interpreting it that way. I've read every translation on this apocryphal writing, and I just don't really see how either one of these guys could be feathers 3 and 4. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see how that plays out. I know people have opinions. I read them. You don't really have to comment. I read them. I follow them. I have a hard time with that. I feel like it's a stretch to say that Donald Trump is going to be feather number 3 and feather number 1. So I'm kind of waiting to see what happens. And the fact that there was this assassination attempt on his life, it really raises the question for me as to the validity. Okay, sorry about that. My kids are trying to tend to themselves while I do this, so I'll have to hurry. But there might be a big mess downstairs when I am done. So Glenn Beck, he's been covering this. He's talking all kinds of different issues that are coming up about Trump's attempted assassination, just little plot holes and questions that are rising. We've got J.D. Vance, who was just named the VP that'll be on the ticket with Trump this election. He's like super conservative, I would say. I think a lot of people see him as like anti-woke. So I think he's probably more conservative in his politics than Trump. And, then we've got all this crazy stuff about this shooter. They still don't even know the motive. And, of course, we see this Impoundment Control Act being challenged by the Trump administration. And, I mean, this is like a repeat of history right now. What's happening, this battle that happened 50 years ago is coming to the forefront again. And it's over control over the money in America. And I think that as I look at all of this imagery and I see all of these things happening, I feel like it gives a little bit of validity to some of these ideas that people have about these parallels that they're seeing with ancient Israel, like what Morgan Philpot has noted. We see almost like history repeating itself again, and the same cycles of pride and cycles of apostasy that occurred in the past are occurring again today. And I feel like that's what I see when I look at this. And so I guess I'll just keep watching and waiting to see what happens if these feather 3 and 4 get devoured by an eagle head, and then what the eagle head looks like, or if it just doesn't fall through, or it does fall through, I should say. Maybe Donald Trump gets reelected, or maybe Joe Biden gets reelected, and then they just keep serving and things just keep going on, in which case I would say this doesn't quite work out. So we'll just have to see what happens. But I wanted to comment on that, maybe get your mind percolating a little bit about some of the past that maybe is coming to the forefront again. Some of these old battles from the 60s and 70s that are being brought to the forefront again in our generation. So basically, our parents and grandparents' generation dealt with it, and now we're dealing with it again, and things are intensifying. And that's kind of my summary of how I see it. And I see it as relating to the signs of the times. I see this as pertaining to the war that's poured out on all nations that'll ultimately lead to a full end of all nations. This is one that's yet to be fulfilled. And in the meantime, I see scattered Israel being gathered and the work of the Lord moving forward. I see all of these signs just playing out on the world stage. And I'm hoping that it all comes to a happy ending soon. And if I'm lucky, maybe I'll get to be there for this awesome time when the Lord comes and can establish peace again on the earth. But if this is right, we've got several difficult things ahead of us. And if this is right too, it's not going to be easy. There's going to be a painful time of just political strife and war in the earth. And I think that we can still have peace through this all because, one of the signs of the times is that even though the Lord's people will be few, the power of God will be with them. And I think that that's something that I try to think about as I don't know, maybe see the headlines, feel a little bit of that anxiety. But the saints will be few in number, but the power of God will be with them. And I want to be one of these covenant-keeping people who can experience the power of God. And I just want to bear my testimony that I know the church is true.
My parents.
Oh, no.
I want them over me.
Oh, no. All right. That's my cue. I've got a kid with a leaky pull-up, so I got to go. But I hope that gives you guys some food for thought. And maybe if it interests you, we can talk about this other Ezra's Eagle Rome theory in a future video. So leave me a comment, like the video if you liked it, and we'll see you later.